Okay, I'm going to try this with these and explaining them. This one has quite a few slides in it, so I'll probably have to break it up into more than one video. This is solving trigonometric equations, and basically you take everything you've learned about trig and algebra and we put it together. So you're solving the basic, you're going to use factoring and the identities. This next one says find all the solutions. You're going to solve equations with multiple angles, trigonometric equations in a quadratic form. Factoring is going to be used a good bit, and you're going to use your identities and possibly a calculator to solve too. In fact, you will need a calculator. Steps. Use your identities in your algebraic strategies to simplify the equation. Just like you solve for x, you want to solve for theta, or for the angle. So you isolate the trig function and then you find the angle. So you're going to use inverse sine, inverse cosine, inverse tan, maybe inverse something else if you really need to for the unit circle. Determine the correct quadrants. All students take calculus. That's saying everything's positive in the first. The second sine, of course, cosecant. Third, tangent, cotangent. And fourth is cosine and secant. Find all your primary angles. Okay, the next slide here is the basic identities that you might need in this section. You may want to copy this and run it off or whatever. These are your Pythagorean identities. Cosine squared plus sine squared equals 1, or sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. Your negative identities. Sine and cosecant change to negative, cosine and secant positive, tangent and cotangent to negative. Your reciprocal, and this is a quotient 1, 2, so keep those in mind as you go through. We're solving this like 2 cosine squared plus cosine is equal to 0. It's kind of like 2x squared plus x equals 0. You would start out by factoring out an x. Well, we're going to start out by factoring a cosine. So 2 cosine t plus 1 is what's left. Set your two factors equal to 0, just like you always do, and solve. Now we need to go find the actual angle where that happens. Where is cosine 0? Well, cosine is x over r, so that's 0 over 1. That occurs at 90 degrees, pi over 2, or 270, 3/2 pi. So pi over 2 and 3/2. Two of the solutions, but there's more. The other factor was 2 cosine t plus 1. So that would be cosine t equals negative 1/2, and that would be in the second and third quadrants. And where it's negative 1/2, you can see that's 2/3. Down here where it's negative 1/2, the cosine basically is your x value here. It would be at 4 pi over 3. Your references are pi over 3, so pi minus pi over 3 and pi plus pi over 3. Here's your complete solution: pi over 2, 2 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, and 3/2 pi. All right, now this one says secant squared minus 5 secant theta equals 6. First of all, you'd set it equal to 0. This could be factored, just like if you had x squared minus 5x minus 6. Factors of x squared would be x and x. Factors of 6 that have a difference of 5. 6 and 1, the 6 would need to be negative. If you foil that back together, you'd get what you started with. Set your two factors equal to 0. Secant theta is equal to 6, and secant theta equals negative 1. And secant theta is equal to 6. Well, you could do inverse here, and you'd get the answer of 140. Okay, secant is positive in first and the fourth quadrant. So in the first quadrant, it's 140, but in the second quadrant, you wouldn't have an angle. Third quadrant, you wouldn't have one. But the fourth quadrant, you would do 2 pi minus the reference. The first quadrant angle is the reference angle, so that's the arithmetic that was done there. 2 pi minus it, and that rounds to 4.88. Okay, now the other part of that is where the negative 1 is. So inverse negative 1, this would have to occur at pi, because secant, remember, is r over x, so that's 1 over negative 1. And x is negative 1 at pi on the unit circle. So this would be all your answers listed, 1.40 and 4.88, and then pi. Okay, you've got another one here. This is 2 sine squared minus 1. We would move the 1 over, and then we would divide by 2 and take the square root of both sides. The square root here was 1, and the square root there would just be the square root of 2. And you multiply it by the square root of 2 over 2 to rationalize it, and we get plus or minus. This actually, since it's plus and minus, it occurs in all 4 quadrants, first, second, third, and fourth. This should be shouting out 45 pi over 4 to you. And if you do it, the first quadrant is pi over 4, in the second quadrant it's 3/4, third it's 5/4, and the fourth it's 7/4. Remember how those are, or you can look at your unit circle also.